The first thing you need to know about me is that I'm not the kind of man who makes scenes. I never have been. 26 years running a custom woodworking shop in Bend, Oregon will do that to you. You learn patience. You learn that the wood doesn't care how you feel about it. It only responds to how you treat it. You learn to be quiet, to observe, to wait. You learn that the most important joints in any structure are the ones nobody ever sees. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 54 years old. I drive a beat-up Ford F-150 that I refuse to replace because it still runs fine, and I was raised not to waste things. I live alone in a house I built myself on the east side of Bend, at the edge of the high desert where the juniper trees start and the city noise stops. And until the night of October 11th, I believe the worst thing that had ever happened to me was losing my wife, Carol, to cancer 11 years ago. I was wrong. My son Nathan called me in August. He was 27, living in Portland, working as a structural engineer for a firm that built bridges across the Pacific Northwest. He had Carol's eyes and my stubbornness, which is either the best or worst combination possible depending on the day. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I said, "You're not sick, are you?" He laughed. "No, I met someone. Like, really met someone." Her name was Olivia Strand, 26, Portland-born, raised partly in Rome because her father had done business there for a decade. She worked in international trade consulting. Nathan said she was brilliant, fierce, funny in the particular way that catches you off guard. I heard his voice when he said her name. I drove to Portland the following weekend just to take him to dinner and listen. That's what fathers do. The Strands requested a formal dinner in mid-October. Both families. Get acquainted. Nathan said they were particular about things like that. He said it carefully, the way you say something when you're hoping the other person won't read too much into it. I read everything into it. I drove to Portland on a Thursday morning. The drive from Bend goes through the Cascades. 3 hours of pine forest, volcanic peaks, the sky doing its October thing where it can't decide between brilliant blue and incoming gray. I spent most of it telling myself not to make assumptions. The dinner was at a restaurant in the Pearl District, the kind of place with no prices on the menu and servers who describe the water. I arrived 15 minutes early, sat at the table, ordered coffee. The Strands arrived 8 minutes late, together, all four of them, which told me something right away. They had coordinated their entrance. That's not something families do by accident. Richard Strand was 61 and looked like a man who had been told his entire life that he was important and had simply decided to believe it. Custom suit, silver cufflinks, the kind of controlled, patient smile that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are always evaluating. He extended his hand to me and shook it the way men shake hands when they've already formed an opinion of you. His wife, Pamela, was elegant in the performative way, not warm elegant, but curated elegant, dressed for an audience. She kissed Nathan on both cheeks like he was a foreign dignitary, then looked at me for just a half-second too long before deciding I wasn't worth the full assessment. Olivia looked like neither of them. She had something real in her face, a small tension around her eyes that told me she was nervous about tonight, in a way that wasn't just excitement. I filed that away. Then there was Brett, Olivia's older brother, 29, already wearing his father's expressions. He shook my hand without standing up from his chair. Nathan sat beside Olivia, beaming. He doesn't see any of this, I thought. He just sees her. The first 20 minutes were fine. Polite. The usual architecture of first meetings, hometowns, careers, how the kids met, safe laughter at safe observations. Richard asked about my work. I told him about the shop. He nodded with the specific interest of a man who has decided not to be interested, but is performing the opposite. Then the menus arrived. Richard said something to Pamela, in Italian, casual, almost throwaway, like it was just the natural way they talked. Pamela responded in Italian. Brett smiled at something. They looked at Nathan and me pleasantly, and kept going. Here's what I need you to understand. I have never told Nathan, never told anyone in Bend, not a single person, that I spent 3 years in Florence when I was 22. I went there after Carol and I had our first breakup, the one before we got back together and got married. I went because I was young and wrecked, and I needed to be somewhere that didn't know my name. I stayed because a furniture maker named Aldo Bianchi gave me a job in his shop and spoke no English and charged me rent in the form of labor, and accidentally became the most important teacher of my life. I learned Italian the hard way. Completely. Fluently. The way you only learn a language when it's the only option you have. I came home at 25, married Carol, built the shop, built the life. Florence became something I kept to myself, not out of secrecy, just out of the quiet understanding that some chapters of a life belong to you alone. I have not spoken Italian in 9 years, but I hear it the way you hear your name across a parking lot. Instantly. Completely. Without effort. If you're watching from somewhere and this story is hitting close to home, whether you've ever been the person in the room that everyone assumed didn't understand, I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, and you love stories where the quiet ones surprise everyone, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. What the Strand said, in Italian, over the white tablecloths and the wine I hadn't touched. Richard said Nathan seemed like a decent young man, but there was a ceiling on him. The word he used, soffitto, felt deliberate, architectural, like he'd thought about the metaphor. Pamela said Olivia had always aimed higher than this, that this phase would pass if managed correctly. Brett said he'd looked Nathan up. The firm was regional, mid-tier. He said the father ran a carpentry store, and his tone made it sound like I sold birdhouses at a farmer's market. Then Richard said the thing that lodged itself between my ribs and stayed there. He said, and I will hear this in my sleep for the rest of my life, the boy has no legacy behind him. He's starting from nothing. Our daughter deserves someone who comes from something. Pamela nodded. Brett refilled his wine. They smiled at me across the table. Nathan smiled back, happy and oblivious, his hand covering Olivia's on the tablecloth. And I sat there, still, quiet, listening to men describe my son like a product they'd decided to return. Don't, I told myself. Not yet. Let them finish. Richard switched back to English for the toast. Warm. Gracious. He raised his glass toward Nathan and me, and said he was so pleased both families could come together, that family was everything, that he looked forward to getting to know us better. He looked right at me when he said it. That smile. That perfect, constructed smile. I looked at my son. Nathan was grinning. He had no idea. He was just a young man in love at a dinner table, believing the best of the people around him the way Carol always did. Fully. Without armor. Because that's just who he was. I'm so sorry, I thought. I'm so sorry you're going to find out what people actually are. I picked up my wine glass. I took one slow sip. I set it down. And then, in Italian, unhurried, clear, with the particular cadence of a man who learned the language in the hills above the Arno River, I said, Richard, I want to thank you for a lovely evening, and I want you to know that I heard every word tonight, all of it, the ceiling comment, the legacy comment, every single word. The table stopped, not gradually, immediately, like someone had cut a wire. Richard's face did something I will never forget, a collapse, then a reconstruction, all in under 2 seconds. A man's mask slipping and snapping back into place. Pamela's hand froze around her wine glass. Brett looked at his father. Olivia. Olivia looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not shock. Something more complicated than shock. And Nathan. Nathan looked at me like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, left enough cash on the table to cover everything. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said in English, for Nathan's sake, and I walked out. I made it to my truck before my hands started shaking. I sat in the Pearl District parking garage for a long time. The concrete smelled like exhaust and rain. Outside, Portland was doing its October thing, a fine mist hanging in the orange streetlights. I wasn't proud of myself. I wasn't angry either. Not yet. What I felt was something colder and more specific. The understanding that I had just publicly humiliated a man who had spent 30 years building a life around never being humiliated. And that man had my son's future in his hands. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Nathan. I stared at it until it stopped. Then it buzzed again. I turned it face down. Think, I told myself. Think before you do anything else. But before I could think, before I could process a single piece of what had just happened, my phone buzzed a third time. Not Nathan. A number I didn't recognize. Oregon area code. Portland. I almost didn't answer. I almost drove home. Instead, something made me pick up. A woman's voice. Calm. Professional. Mr. Reeves, my name is Diane Kohler. I'm a financial investigative journalist with the Oregon Tribune. I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. I think we need to talk about Richard Strand. I went completely still. What about him? I said. A pause. Mr. Reeves, what do you know about where his money actually comes from? The answer to that question changes everything. And I mean everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the guest room of the Portland hotel I'd booked, a mid-range place off Burnside, nothing special, and stared at the ceiling while the rain worked itself into a full Oregon downpour outside the window. Diane Kohler had talked for 40 minutes on the phone. I had said almost nothing, just listened, which, if you've been paying attention, is what I do. Here's what she told me. Richard Strand's import trade consulting business, Strand Pacific Group, processed contracts between American manufacturers and overseas suppliers across 6 countries. On paper, it was clean, legitimate, the kind of operation that generated profile pieces in Portland Business Journal and a mention in Oregon's top 50 entrepreneurs list 2 years running. Below the paper, Diane had spent 8 months finding something else entirely. Inflated invoicing, supplier kickbacks routed through a shell company, registered in Delaware, that existed for no other documented purpose. A pattern of contract, steering toward vendors with financial relationships to Richard personally, relationships his clients didn't know about and hadn't consented to. Not narcotics, not weapons, something duller and more sustainable, systematic financial fraud, dressed in the clothing of legitimate consulting. The kind that requires patience and sophistication to uncover because it's designed to look like paperwork rather than crime. Why are you calling me? I finally asked her. Because 3 of his former business partners have gone quiet in the last 6 months. One of them, a man named Gary Tesler, Eugene-based, was about to talk to me. Then he wasn't. What happened to him? Another pause. He accepted a settlement, signed an NDA, moved to Arizona. I sat with that. And you think I can help you how exactly? Mr. Reeves, I've been watching Richard Strand for 8 months. I know who his daughter is dating. I know who you are. And I know that whatever happened at dinner tonight, Richard Strand is going to wake up tomorrow morning and start making calls. She let that sit. I'm not asking you to be my source, she said. I'm asking you to be careful. She hung up before I could respond. I drove back to Bend the next morning in the rain. 3 hours through the Cascades with the wipers going, and my phone sitting silent on the passenger seat. Nathan hadn't texted again after the 2 missed calls. That silence was its own message. He was processing, sorting through what he'd seen, deciding how he felt about his father standing up at a dinner table and detonating a grenade. I should have stayed quiet, part of me said. The other part said, you stayed quiet for 54 years. Look where it got you. I pulled into Bend around noon. The high desert had its late October look, pale sky, juniper scrub, the Cascades behind me still holding their first snow on the peaks. I drove straight to the shop, unlocked it, started working. When I don't know what to do, I build things. Always have. That afternoon I built nothing useful. I just stood at the workbench and ran a hand plane across a piece of Douglas fir for 2 hours, thinking. Nathan called on Sunday. 4 days of silence, then his voice. Careful, measured, trying to sound neutral and not quite managing it. I need to understand what happened, he said. I told him. Not everything. Not Diane Kohler. Not what she'd told me about Richard. Just the dinner. What they said, word for word. Long silence. You understood all of it? Every word. And you never told me you spoke Italian. It never came up. Another silence. Longer. Olivia called me, he said finally. She was upset, not at you, at her father. She said she didn't know they were going to do that. I believe her, I thought. I believed her at the table. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her I needed a few days. Nathan. Dad. His voice tightened. I'm not breaking up with her because of one dinner. I love her. But I need to figure out what I'm walking into. Fair, I thought. That's exactly right. Then figure it out, I said. And while you're doing that, be careful how much you share with her family about your plans, about work, about anything. Silence. What aren't you telling me? Nothing yet, I said. I promise you, when I know something worth telling, you'll be the first call I make. He accepted that. Reluctantly. We said goodbye and I stood in the shop in the dark because I'd forgotten to turn the lights on, holding a phone that had gone quiet, understanding that the distance I'd heard in my son's voice was not anger. It was the beginning of doubt. And doubt, once it starts, is very hard to stop. Richard Strand made his first move 11 days later. I almost missed it. Nathan called, different tone this time, flatter, to say that his firm had been approached about a major contract. A bridge rehabilitation project in the Willamette Valley, significant money, multi-year engagement. The referral had come through a consulting contact of the project owner. The consulting contact was Strand Pacific Group. There it is, I thought. I kept my voice even. That's a big project. You interested? Of course. It would basically guarantee my path to senior engineer. Who would you be working under? The project owner's team. But the referral relationship. Richard has some involvement in the oversight structure. It's complicated. I bet it is. Take your time deciding, I said. Don't let anyone rush you. Dad, it's a career opportunity. I know what it looks like, I said. That's what I'm thinking about. I called Diane Kohler the next morning, not to become her source, to ask her one question. Strand Pacific Group, I said. Does Richard use project referrals as leverage? Does he put people inside business relationships so he has visibility into their decisions? Pause. That's one of his primary methods, she said. Why? I told her about Nathan's opportunity. Another pause. Longer. Mr. Reeves, she said carefully. If your son takes that contract, Richard Strand will have a financial relationship with your son's career for the next 3 to 5 years. He will know things about your son's professional standing before your son knows them. He will have the ability to expand that relationship or quietly damage it, depending on what serves him. I already knew this. I needed to hear it said out loud by someone else. I need to ask you something, I said. Go ahead. How close are you to having enough? She knew what I meant. I'm close, she said, but I'm missing the Delaware connection. The shell company. I can see its activity, but I can't establish Richard's direct control. I need documentation, something that puts his name on the structure. What kind of documentation? A signature, an email, anything internal that shows he knew what the entity was doing. I thought about what she'd said about Gary Tesler, the man who was going to talk, then moved to Arizona. The NDA Tesler signed, I said. Does it cover documents he retained before he signed it? Silence. Legally, it's complicated, she said slowly. But if Tesler had documents that predate the NDA, theoretically, the NDA wouldn't cover them. He'd have to choose to cooperate voluntarily, and he'd have to not be afraid to. What if he wasn't afraid? Then we'd have a conversation worth having. I wrote down Gary Tesler's name on a piece of paper and pinned it to the corkboard above my workbench. Then I started making calls. Maybe you've experienced something like this, watching someone quietly work to dismantle something you love, and knowing that if you move too fast, you'll lose everything. I don't know what you would have done, but I know what I decided to do. Finding Gary Tesler took me 2 weeks and cost me 3 favors from people I hadn't spoken to in years. He was in Scottsdale, retired, 63 years old. He had a landscaping business. He ran part-time that didn't need to make money and existed mostly so he had something to do with his hands. A man I understood immediately. I flew to Arizona on a Wednesday in November. Did not tell Nathan. Did not tell Diane. Gary Tesler opened the door of his Scottsdale house and looked at me, The way men look at strangers who show up unannounced. Cautious, assessing, not quite hostile. I said, "My name is Daniel Reeves. My son is engaged to Richard Strand's daughter. I drove 4 hours to Portland last month and sat at a dinner table while Richard Strand decided my son wasn't good enough for his family. And then I found out that wasn't even close to the worst thing Richard Strand has done." Gary looked at me for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." We talked for 3 hours. Gary Tesler was not a coward. He was a man who had been made afraid by a person who understood how to use the legal system as a weapon, not to win cases, but to exhaust people. Richard had threatened Gary not with prosecution, but with civil litigation. Years of it. Depositions, legal fees, public association with a fraud investigation whether or not Gary was guilty of anything. Gary had a sick wife. He had retirement savings he couldn't afford to burn through. He took the settlement. He moved. He had hated himself for it every day since. He had also kept copies of everything. Before he signed the NDA, files on an external hard drive sitting in a fireproof lockbox in the closet of his home office, because Gary Tesler was a careful man, and careful men keep records. He retrieved the hard drive while I sat at his kitchen table. He held it for a moment. "If I give you this," he said, "and it goes where I think you're going with it, Richard will know it came from me." "Yes," I said. "He will. He'll come after me." "He'll try," I said. "But he'll be doing it while a federal investigation is opening, and every journalist in Oregon is writing his name. He's going to have other things to manage." Gary turned the hard drive over in his hands. "Your son," he said. "He good?" "He's the best person I know," I said. "And he has no idea what's coming for him if we don't stop it." Gary set the hard drive on the table, pushed it toward me. "There's an email chain in the folder labeled SPG Delaware 2019, he said. "Richard's personal email, his signature, his instructions, everything Diane Kohler needs." I picked it up. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," Gary said. "Just make sure it counts." I flew back to Bend that night, landed at Redmond Airport at 10:15, drove home through the dark desert, the hard drive in my jacket pocket, the juniper trees passing in the headlights like silent witnesses. I should have felt something like relief. I didn't. Because somewhere over Nevada, at 30,000 feet, I had opened my email and found a message from a sender I didn't recognize. A generic Gmail address, no name. 4 words. "Stop, while you still can." I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked out the airplane window, at the dark country below. He already knows, I thought. He knew before I got on the plane. Which meant Richard Strand had someone watching me. Which meant this was no longer just a father protecting his son. This had become something else entirely. And somewhere in Portland, my son was having dinner with the woman he loved, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already started to move. I didn't respond to the email. That was the first decision. The second decision was not calling Diane. Not yet. Because if Richard had someone close enough to know I'd flown to Arizona, then my phone was a liability I couldn't afford to ignore. I drove home from Redmond Airport at 11 at night, parked in my garage, sat in the dark truck with the hard drive in my jacket pocket, and thought about the 4 words. Stop, while you still can. Not a threat of violence. Richard Strand wasn't that kind of man. He was the kind of man who destroyed things quietly, careers, reputations, financial futures, with paperwork and patience and the particular confidence of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. The email was a message about capability. He was telling me he had reach. He was telling me he knew what I was doing before I finished doing it. He was also telling me he was afraid. Good, I thought. Afraid men make mistakes. I called Diane from a prepaid phone I bought at a Walgreens in Bend the following morning. She picked up on the second ring. I told her about Gary, about the hard drive, about the email. She went quiet in the way journalists go quiet when something has just changed the shape of a story they've been building for 8 months. "The Delaware folder," she said finally. "You're sure it's there?" Gary was sure. And Gary kept those files for 4 years because he knew someday he might need them. Daniel, first time she'd used my first name. If what you're describing is on that drive, this isn't just a story anymore. This is a federal case. I know, which means the moment I publish, Richard's attorneys will try to trace the documentation chain back to its source. Back to Gary, back to you. I know that too. And you're still giving it to me. I'm giving it to you, I said, because my son is about to sign a contract that puts his career inside Richard Strand's hands for the next 5 years, and because a man named Gary Tesler spent 4 years in Scottsdale hating himself for signing a piece of paper that made him disappear. And because the only thing worse than what Richard did is everyone who could have stopped it deciding not to. Silence. I need 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. Can you keep Nathan from signing that contract for a month? I'll figure it out. And Daniel, you need to be careful about Olivia. I went still. What about her? I don't know whose side she's on, Diane said. And right now, that matters. That question stayed with me for 10 days. Olivia Strand, 26. Something real in her face at that dinner table. The tension around her eyes that didn't look like excitement. The fact that Nathan said she was upset at her father, not at me after the dinner. I see more than they think I do. She hadn't said that. Not yet. But I'd seen it in her face. I needed to know if I was reading her right. Because if I was wrong about Olivia, everything I was building could come apart in a single conversation between her and Richard. The meeting happened on a Tuesday in late November. Nathan was at work. I drove to Portland without telling him. I texted Olivia from the prepaid phone, identified myself, asked for 30 minutes, told her to come alone and not mention it to anyone. She showed up. That told me something right there. We met at a coffee shop in Northwest Portland, the kind of neighborhood place with mismatched chairs and the smell of rain-soaked wool from everyone's jackets. She was already there when I arrived, hands wrapped around a mug, watching the door. I sat down across from her. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "My father had you followed to Arizona. I know. He thinks you're trying to destroy our family." "I'm trying to protect my son," I said. "Those might look similar from where your father is standing." She looked at her coffee. "What Gary Tesler gave you. My father knows Gary kept copies. He's known for years. He calculated that Gary was too afraid to use them. That calculation was wrong." "Yes." She looked up. "It was." I studied her face. The tension was still there, but it was different now. Not nervousness, something more like resolve. "Olivia," I said carefully, "what do you know about your father's business?" Long pause. "More than he thinks I do," she said. "Less than I wish I didn't." She knew. Not everything, but enough. The way children of powerful men always know. Partially, intuitively, through the gaps in conversations that stopped when they entered rooms. "I love Nathan," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "I'm not going to let my father turn him into leverage. I won't let that happen." "Then I need you to do one thing," I said. "What?" "Don't warn him. Don't give him time to move anything. Whatever happens in the next 3 weeks, act normal. Can you do that?" She held my gaze for a long moment. "My mother is going to be devastated," she said quietly. "I know. My brother is going to lose everything he thought he was inheriting. I know that too. And my father—" She stopped, looked away. Something crossed her face that I recognized. The particular grief of loving someone you can no longer defend. He built something real once, before all of this. He used to be someone I was proud of. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. She nodded once, stood up, pulled on her coat. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, I confirmed. She walked out into the Portland rain, and I sat there with my coffee going cold, understanding that I had just asked a 26-year-old woman to help me dismantle her father. And she had said yes. Keeping Nathan from signing the contract required the most careful conversation I've ever had. I couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. So I told him a version of it, that I had concerns about the referral structure, that I'd done some research on Strand Pacific Group and found some inconsistencies I couldn't explain, that I was asking him as his father to give me 30 days before he committed to anything. He was frustrated. I heard it clearly. Dad, this is my career, not yours. I know. You've been against this family from the beginning. That one landed somewhere tender. I've been against being dismissed without being known. That's different. Silence. 30 days, he said finally. That's all I'm giving you. 28 of those days were the longest of my life. Diane called me on a Thursday morning in mid-December. The sky over Bend was iron gray, the kind of cold that comes off the Cascades and settles into the high desert like it owns the place. I was in the shop. I answered on the first ring. It's done, she said. We're publishing Sunday. I set down the chisel I was holding. Everything? The Delaware entity, the signature chain, the inflated invoicing structure across 4 contracts, the Tesla settlement referenced as part of a pattern. Legal has been over it for 10 days. It's solid, Daniel. It's as solid as anything I've ever published. And Gary? Gary gave a recorded statement. He's no longer hiding. I stood in my shop in the December cold and let that sink in. One more thing, Diane said. The Oregon Department of Justice received an anonymous referral package 2 weeks ago. I don't know who sent it. I didn't say anything. The timing suggests they'll have opened a preliminary inquiry before we publish, she said, which means when the story drops Sunday, Richard Strand will be walking into it from 2 directions simultaneously. Good, I said. You didn't send that referral package, she said. Not a question. No, I said. I didn't. A pause. Olivia Strand has an undergraduate degree in business law, Diane said quietly. I closed my eyes. 26 years old, I thought. And she figured out the move I didn't think to make. I called Nathan on Saturday night. Told him to sit down. Then I told him everything. From the beginning. Florence. The dinner. What I heard. Diane Kohler. Gary Tesler. Arizona. The hard drive. The referral package that I was now certain his girlfriend had sent to the state attorney general's office on her own. He didn't speak for a very long time. When he finally did, his voice was something I'd never heard from him before. Not anger, not shock. She knew, he said. Olivia knew what you were doing. She figured most of it out herself. And she didn't tell her father. No. Another silence. Dad. His voice cracked slightly on the word. Just slightly. Why didn't you just tell me from the beginning? And there it was. The question I'd been carrying since October. Because you were in love, I said. And I needed you to stay in love long enough to let me find out if she deserved it. If I'd told you at the beginning, you would have had to choose sides before you knew who anyone really was. I didn't want you choosing in the dark. Long silence. Was that the right call? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. I made it because I'm your father, and I was scared, and it was the best I could do. The story published Sunday morning at 6 a.m. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By 4 in the afternoon, Strand Pacific Group had released a statement through their attorneys describing the reporting as misleading and promising a full response. By 7, the Oregon Department of Justice confirmed a preliminary inquiry was underway. Richard Strand did not call me, did not email the prepaid phone, did not appear. He disappeared into the machinery of consequence, which is exactly where men like Richard Strand eventually end up, not in a dramatic confrontation, not in a single visible moment of reckoning, but in the grinding, unglamorous process of being held accountable by systems that don't care how well you dress. Nathan and Olivia sat together through all of it. I don't know everything they said to each other in those first days. I wasn't there, and I didn't ask. What I know is that they came through it, not easily, not without damage, but together. The way people come through things when they've chosen each other for the right reasons. Pamela Strand stopped speaking to Olivia for 6 weeks. Brett Strand, to his credit, called Nathan directly and apologized, not for his father, just for himself, for what he'd said at dinner that Nathan never even heard. Nathan told him it was a start. Richard Strand entered into a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors the following March. No prison, fines, disgorgement. a permanent bar from federal contracting. The gleaming surface of Strand Pacific Group quietly dissolved. The Portland Business Journal profile came down from the website. The top 50 entrepreneurs mentioned disappeared in the next edition's update. He did not become a cautionary tale anyone told loudly. He became the quieter kind, the kind people in certain Portland business circles referenced in lowered voices when the subject of reputation came up. I felt no satisfaction when I heard. I want to be honest about that. I thought I would. I had imagined, during those dark November nights in Bend, that the moment of consequence would feel like something releasing, like a joint fitting together cleanly. It didn't feel like that. It felt like grief with the edges worn off, like watching a fire that had finally burned down to nothing, and understanding that something had been lost in it that was never going to grow back. Nathan and Olivia married the following September. Small ceremony outside Bend, in the high desert, with the Cascades behind them, holding the last of the summer snow on their peaks. 30 people. No performance. Richard walked Olivia down the aisle. He shook my hand at the reception. Not the handshake from October. Not the handshake of a man who has already decided. A different one, shorter, quieter, carrying in it the particular weight of a man who has had several months to understand the distance between who he believed he was and who he actually turned out to be. He said, "You didn't have to stop where you stopped." I said, "I know." He nodded, moved away. I stood at the edge of the reception and watched my son dance with his wife in the September light, the desert wind moving through the juniper trees at the edge of the property, the sky doing its Oregon thing, enormous and indifferent and achingly beautiful. Carol would have loved this, I thought. She would have known exactly what to do at that dinner table. She would have been kinder about it than I was. But she also would have been proud. I picked up my glass, drank to her quietly, the way I always do, alone but not lonely, which, at 54, is the best any of us can ask for. I still run the shop in Bend. I still drive the same truck. I haven't spoken Italian to anyone since that December phone call with Diane Kohler. But sometimes, late at night when the shop is quiet and I'm finishing something by hand, I catch myself thinking in it, in the language of the city that made me, in the voice of an old man named Aldo, who taught me that the best work is invisible. The joints you never see are the ones that hold everything together. I've thought about that night in Portland 1,000 times since, whether I handled it the right way, whether the silence I chose, keeping Nathan in the dark, carrying it alone, was protection or just a father too proud to ask for help. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. Richard Strand looked at a quiet man in a brown jacket and saw nothing worth accounting for. He made the oldest mistake powerful people make. He confused silence with ignorance. He confused patience with weakness. He confused a man who doesn't take up much space with a man who has nothing worth protecting. He was wrong on all 3 counts. Here's what I want to ask you, and I mean this honestly. If you had been sitting at that table, if you had heard every word they said about your child, if you had the means to stop it, but stopping it meant your son might not forgive you, and an entire family might be destroyed, and you might spend the rest of your life wondering if you went too far, would you have done what I did? Or would you have stayed quiet? Tell me in the comments, because I'm still not entirely sure I have the answer.